Let me tell you about the time I showed up to clinical running on exactly two things: anxiety and a vending machine cappuccino. Spoiler alert, it did not go well. It was the middle of the week. Early morning clinical rotation. I had been up late the night before doing what nursing students do, reviewing disease processes, going over medications, trying to mentally prepare for whatever was going to walk through that door in the morning. Because you don't know your patient assignment the night before. You find out when you get there. So you just try to prepare for everything and hope for the best. I woke up, threw on my scrubs, grabbed the only thing the hospital vending machine had left at 6 a.m., which was some kind of cappuccino situation in a plastic cup that I am fairly certain was 80% sugar and 20% false hope. And I walked onto that floor feeling ready. I was not ready. About 2 hours in, my preceptor pulled me aside to do what I thought was going to be a quick teaching moment. She asked me to walk her through the pathophysiology of why our patient's potassium was trending down, and I want you to understand, I knew this. I had reviewed it the night before. I had taught this concept to other students. I knew exactly what was happening in that distal nephron, but I opened my mouth and I got nothing, like a loading screen with no signal. I could feel the information sitting somewhere in my brain, but I could not access it. It was like knowing your phone is in the house, but you have no idea which room. I stumbled through it. I got some of it right, but I also got some of it wrong. And my preceptor, bless her, just gave me that look. You know the look, the calm, quiet, I am not surprised look. And then she said, very simply, when's the last time you ate? And I had to actually think about it, because the answer was dinner the night before, which had been roughly 14 hours ago. I had not eaten. I had slept poorly. I had consumed something that was technically a beverage but was doing absolutely nothing for my brain. And then I had shown up and tried to perform complex clinical reasoning under pressure on a completely empty tank. I remember feeling so embarrassed and frustrated because I thought the problem was that I hadn't studied hard enough. I thought I had a knowledge gap. I was already running through what I needed to go back and review, what I needed to look up, what I was obviously missing in my understanding of renal physiology. But that wasn't it. I knew the material. I just couldn't access it. My brain had literally checked out because I hadn't given it what it needed to function. And that was the moment I started thinking about nutrition differently. Not as a wellness thing, not as a diet thing, but as a performance thing, as a clinical reasoning thing. Because here's what nobody told me in nursing school. Your brain is an organ, and like every other organ in your body, it requires specific substrates to function. You would never expect a patient's heart to maintain cardiac output when they're volume depleted. You would never expect their kidneys to concentrate urine without adequate perfusion. But somehow, we expect our own brains to perform complex cognitive tasks, pattern recognition, clinical decision-making, differential diagnosis, while running on fumes, caffeine, and stress hormones. That is not a knowledge problem, that is a fuel problem. And today we are going to talk about how to fix it. Welcome to Think Like a Provider. I'm Jenna Way, nurse practitioner, clinical educator, and creator of Think Like a Provider, the clinical reasoning system that teaches nurses and nursing students to master body systems through pathophysiology and evidence-based mechanism frameworks. We don't memorize here, we understand. If you're new, every episode we break down the mechanisms behind clinical reasoning, neuroscience, and what it actually takes to perform at your best so you walk away thinking and acting like the provider you are meant to be. And if you want to go deeper than a podcast can take you, we have the Think Like a Provider Academy on School. There is a waiting list for that. Courses, question banks, and community of students who are done memorizing and ready to actually understand. We have the free Facebook community as well. The link is always in the show notes. Now, let's get into it. All right, so today's episode is our wellness and neuroscience installment for the month, and I want to be really clear up front about what this is and what it isn't. This is not a nutrition episode in the wellness influencer sense. I am not here to tell you what to eat for your skin, or your gut microbiome, or your relationship with food. That is not what we do. This is a clinical performance episode. We are talking about nutrition, the same way we talk about pathophysiology, through mechanisms. What does your brain actually need to function? What happens when those needs aren't met? And how does that directly affect your ability to reason clinically? That is the lens. Let's go. Your brain on empty. Let's start with some basic neuroscience, because if you're going to feed your brain right, you should actually understand what your brain is and what it does. Your brain is approximately 2% of your total body weight. 2%. This small, wrinkled, slightly gelatinous organ tucked inside your skull, 2% of you, and yet it accounts for roughly 20% of your total energy expenditure at rest. 20%. While you're literally just sitting there doing nothing, your brain is burning through 1/5 of your body's entire energy budget. Now run a clinical shift. Add decision fatigue. Add stress. Add 12 hours of constant cognitive load, history taking, physical assessment, lab interpretation, medication reconciliation, documentation, communicating with the team, educating the patient. Your brain's energy demand goes up significantly. The primary fuel source for your brain is glucose. Not ketones, not fatty acids, glucose. Your neurons have a preferred substrate, and it's glucose. Specifically, your brain prefers a steady, continuous supply of glucose because, unlike your muscle cells, your neurons cannot store glycogen. They do not have a reserve tank. What is in your blood right now is what your brain has to work with right now. So what happens when blood glucose drops? Here's where it gets interesting and very relevant to your clinical performance. Not all regions of your brain respond equally to glucose deprivation. The prefrontal cortex, the region responsible for executive function, working memory, complex reasoning, and decision-making, is among the first to show functional impairment when glucose drops. Let that sit for a second. The part of your brain you need most to do your job, the part that lets you think critically, weigh options, recognize patterns, make decisions, that's the first to go offline when you haven't eaten. And this is not subtle. Research on cognitive performance and glycemic levels has consistently shown that even mild hypoglycemia, blood glucose in the low normal range, not even technically pathological, is enough to measurably impair prefrontal cortex function. We're talking about reduced working memory capacity, slower processing speed, impaired attention, and decreased cognitive flexibility. Let me connect this to something we talked about back in episode 3. I introduced the concept of working memory as a filing cabinet, specifically a very small filing cabinet. You've got roughly 4 to 7 slots. That's it. That's your cognitive workspace. Everything you're actively processing right now lives in those slots. When you're doing clinical reasoning, those slots are filling up fast. Your patient's chief complaint in one slot, relevant history in another, current vitals in another, your differential in another, the medication interaction you're trying to remember in another. You need every single one of those slots functioning at full capacity. When your blood glucose drops and your prefrontal cortex starts to underperform, you lose slots. Your working memory capacity contracts. You're now trying to perform the same clinical reasoning task with fewer cognitive resources than you started with. And the work doesn't get easier just because your brain is running low. The patients are still complex, the decisions are still high stakes, and your preceptor is still watching. This is not a willpower problem. It's not a focus problem. It's not that you're not smart enough or prepared enough. It is literally a substrate problem. Your neurons are trying to fire and they don't have adequate fuel to do it. And here's the cruel irony. When you're stressed, which as a nursing student in clinical, you are essentially always, your cortisol is elevated. Cortisol promotes gluconeogenesis and initially spikes blood sugar, but it also accelerates glucose utilization. The more stressed you are, the faster your brain burns through its available fuel. So the exact moment when you need your brain to perform most, when your preceptor is watching, when something goes wrong, when you get pimped on a concept, is the exact moment your fuel tank is burning down the fastest. Your brain on empty is not just tired, it is physiologically impaired, and no amount of reviewing your notes the night before will compensate for showing up to clinical without adequate glucose to power the neurons that are supposed to access those notes. The nursing student nutrition problem. Now let's talk about why this is such a pervasive problem in clinical training specifically. Because nursing students are not nutritionally impaired because they're lazy or uninformed. They're nutritionally impaired because the system is not set up for them to do anything else. Think about your average clinical day. You wake up somewhere between 4:30 and 6 a.m., depending on the site and the commute. You either don't have time to eat before you leave, or you don't have an appetite because your cortisol is already elevated from the anticipatory stress of clinical. You get on the floor. You get your patient assignment. For the next 4 to 8 hours, you are going. You may or may not get a break. When you do, you have 15 to 20 minutes, and the choices available to you are the vending machine, the hospital cafeteria if it's open, or whatever you frantically packed at 5:30 a.m. Then you go home, you decompress, you do your post-clinical documentation or care plan, you eat dinner, often late, often whatever is fastest, and then you try to study, which does not go well because your brain is fried, and then you sleep, and then you wake up and do it again. That is the cycle. And that cycle has a nutrition profile that looks something like this. Long stretches of no food, punctuated by high sugar, high caffeine, low protein options grabbed on the run. It is the exact opposite of what your brain needs. Now let's layer in cortisol, because this is where it gets really ugly. Cortisol is your primary stress hormone. It is also, not coincidentally, involved in glucose regulation. When cortisol is chronically elevated, which is exactly what happens with prolonged academic and clinical stress, it does several things. It drives cravings for high sugar, high fat foods because your brain is trying to restore energy reserves. It impairs insulin sensitivity, which means your blood sugar regulation becomes less efficient. It disrupts sleep, which further impairs glucose metabolism, and it increases appetite in the short term while suppressing it in a paradoxical way during acute stress, which is why you can be simultaneously starving and have no appetite before a nerve-wracking clinical shift. The cortisol nutrition cycle is vicious and self-reinforcing. Chronic stress leads to poor eating. Poor eating causes blood sugar dysregulation. Blood sugar dysregulation impairs cognitive function. Impaired cognitive function makes clinical more stressful. More stress, more cortisol, more cravings, more poor eating. Around and around you go. Now, let's talk about caffeine, because I know you are not going to give it up, and I'm not going to tell you to. But you need to understand what it is actually doing. Caffeine is an adenosine receptor antagonist. Adenosine is a byproduct of neural activity. The more your neurons fire, the more adenosine builds up. And the more adenosine builds up, the more you feel fatigued and want to sleep. It's your brain's natural slow down signal. Caffeine works by blocking those receptors, so the adenosine can't deliver its message. You don't actually have more energy. The fatigue debt is still there. You've just blocked the signal. In the short term, genuinely useful. Improved alertness, slightly faster reaction time, some evidence of enhanced focus for tasks that don't require complex reasoning, which is fine. The problem is how nursing students use caffeine. They use it as a meal replacement. They use it on an empty stomach, which spikes cortisol. They consume amounts that push them into anxiety territory, jittery, heart racing, on edge, which further elevates cortisol and impairs fine cognitive function. And then there's the crash. You know the crash. Around 2 p.m., somewhere around hour 6 of your shift. Suddenly, you can't think. Everything feels harder. You're irritable. You may have a headache. Your clinical performance tanks. You reach for more caffeine, which delays the crash but doesn't prevent it. And when it finally comes, it comes harder. That afternoon, cognitive valley is real. It is well documented in the neuroscience literature, and it is significantly worsened by poor morning nutrition and caffeine overconsumption. The blood sugar peak from your vending machine snack at 8 a.m. is long gone. The caffeine adenosine blockade is wearing off, and the accumulated adenosine is flooding back. Your prefrontal cortex is running on fumes, and you've got 4 more hours of clinical left. This is not a discipline problem. It is a physiology problem, and physiology has solutions. What your brain actually needs. I want to be very clear about what this section is not. This is not a meal plan. This is not a grocery list. This is not me telling you to meal prep anything. This is mechanisms, because mechanisms are what we do here. When you understand why your brain needs specific nutrients, you make better decisions instinctively, not because you're following a plan, but because you understand what's at stake. Let's start with omega-3 fatty acids, specifically DHA, docosahexaenoic acid. DHA is a structural component of neuronal cell membranes. Approximately 30 to 35% of your brain's gray matter is DHA. It's not just a fuel source, it's literally building material. DHA is critical for neuroplasticity, the ability of your neurons to form new synaptic connections, strengthen existing pathways, and remodel in response to learning. Think about what happens when you're in clinical and you're building pattern recognition. You're seeing patients, you're seeing presentations, you're connecting the clinical picture to the pathophysiology, and your brain is forming implicit memories, the kind we talked about in episode 7, the deep pattern recognition that eventually lets you walk into a room and just know something is wrong before you can articulate why. That process requires neuroplasticity. It requires your brain to be physically capable of building and strengthening connections. DHA supports that process at the structural level. Omega-3 deficiency doesn't just affect mood, which is what most people associate with it. It affects the physical architecture of your brain's learning machinery. Next, protein. And I'm not going to talk to you about muscle building or macros. I'm going to talk to you about neurotransmitters because that's what actually matters here. Your neurotransmitters, dopamine, serotonin, acetylcholine, norepinephrine, are made from amino acids which come from dietary protein. Dopamine and norepinephrine are synthesized from tyrosine. Serotonin is synthesized from tryptophan. Acetylcholine, the neurotransmitter critical for learning, attention, and memory consolidation, requires choline, which comes from egg yolks, among other sources. When you don't eat enough protein, you are literally limiting the raw materials your brain needs to produce the neurotransmitters that regulate attention, motivation, learning, and mood. Acetylcholine, specifically, is critical for the kind of focused, deliberate learning and memory formation you need in clinical. When choline is inadequate, acetylcholine synthesis drops, and with it, your capacity for focused attention and memory encoding. You cannot think clearly if your brain cannot make the chemicals it needs to think. This is not a metaphor. This is biochemistry. Now, complex carbohydrates. The key word is complex, not simple sugars, not refined carbohydrates, not the donut in the break room. Complex carbohydrates, oats, whole grains, legumes, starchy vegetables, are digested and absorbed slowly, resulting in a gradual, sustained release of glucose into the bloodstream. This is what your brain wants: a steady, continuous supply of its preferred fuel. Simple sugars, the vending machine cappuccino, the pastry, the candy, spike blood glucose rapidly, which triggers an aggressive insulin response, which causes blood glucose to drop rapidly. The very spike that feels like energy in the moment sets you up for a crash within 1 to 2 hours. Your brain gets a burst of fuel followed by a fuel shortage, and that shortage hits right when you're in the middle of a clinical shift. Complex carbohydrates give you a slow-burning supply. No spike, no crash. Stable glucose, stable prefrontal cortex, stable clinical performance. And finally, hydration. This one does not get enough attention. Research consistently shows that dehydration of as little as 1 to 2% of body weight, a level so mild that most people don't even feel thirsty yet, is sufficient to measurably impair cognitive performance. We're talking about reduced attention, impaired short-term memory, slower psychomotor speed, and increased perception of difficulty on cognitive tasks. 2%. Nurses are chronically dehydrated on clinical shifts. You're moving constantly. You're not always near a water source. And you're not prioritizing fluids because you're thinking about 100 other things. But your brain is approximately 75% water. And the electrochemical gradients that allow neurons to fire depend on proper fluid balance. When you are dehydrated, your neurons are less efficient. Drink your water. Not because it's on a wellness checklist, because your neurons need the electrochemical environment that adequate hydration provides. What's sabotaging your clinical reasoning? Let's be specific about the saboteurs. These are the common patterns I see in nursing students that are actively working against cognitive performance. The first is the preclinical sugar hit. The donut, the pastry, the gas station muffin, the sugary yogurt parfait that seems healthy but has 40 grams of added sugar. I understand why people do this. You need something fast, it's there, it hits the dopamine system immediately, and feels like fuel. But here's what actually happens. Your blood glucose spikes within 30 to 45 minutes of eating it. You feel briefly alert and energized. Then your insulin response overcorrects. Your blood sugar drops, often below your pre-meal baseline, and by the time you're 2 hours into your shift, you are cognitively impaired. The very thing you ate to prepare for clinical has set up a blood sugar crash timed perfectly to coincide with your most demanding clinical hours. The donut before clinical is not a fuel source, it is a ticking clock. The second saboteur is caffeine overconsumption. Not caffeine use, caffeine overconsumption. There's a meaningful difference between one well-timed cup of coffee with a balanced meal and your fourth espresso on an empty stomach. At high doses, caffeine increases cortisol, increases anxiety, impairs fine motor coordination, and produces the jittery, wired but not focused state that many students mistake for alertness. Jittery is not focused, anxious is not sharp, and the crash on the other side is proportional to the amount you consumed. The third is meal skipping, which I've already talked about extensively, but I want to name explicitly as a clinical performance saboteur. There is no compensation mechanism that makes meal skipping okay for clinical reasoning. Your brain cannot run a deficit. There is no system in your body that says, we're low on glucose, but the clinical shift is important, so let's upregulate emergency cognition. When glucose drops, cognitive function drops. That's the mechanism. Skipping meals before clinical is making an unforced error. And the fourth is night shift eating, which deserves its own mention because the stakes are different. If you are doing night shift rotations or working night shift as an RN, your circadian rhythm is already fighting you. Your body is physiologically calibrated to expect sleep when it's dark and food when it's light. Night shift disrupts both of those systems simultaneously. Your metabolism is less efficient at night. Glucose tolerance is actually lower during nighttime hours, meaning the same meal you eat at 7 p.m. hits your blood sugar differently than at 2 a.m. Many night shift workers experience significant cognitive impairment in the early morning hours, the 3 to 6 a.m. window. That is a combination of circadian low, cumulative fatigue, and often poor eating patterns throughout the shift. If you work nights, the timing of what you eat matters as much as what you eat. The clinical reasoning connection. I want to make sure you fully understand why all of this is directly about your ability to think like a provider, because this is not a wellness episode. This is a clinical performance episode. Here's the through line. You cannot recognize patterns if your brain is starving. Pattern recognition, the process of seeing a constellation of symptoms, vital signs, and history and connecting it to a known clinical picture, is a function of your associative cortex, working in coordination with your working memory and long-term memory stores. All of those systems depend on adequate glucose to function. When fuel is low, pattern recognition slows. Things that you should be able to connect quickly take longer. Or you miss them entirely. You cannot access working memory if your glucose is crashed. Working memory is your cognitive workspace. It's where you're actively holding your patient's story, your differential, your intervention options. When prefrontal cortex function drops due to hypoglycemia, your working memory capacity contracts. You lose slots. And when you're working with fewer cognitive resources, you're more likely to anchor on the first diagnosis that comes to mind rather than generating a full differential, which is exactly how diagnostic errors happen. You cannot think under pressure if cortisol is spiking. The prefrontal cortex, the thinking brain, is functionally suppressed by high cortisol. This is evolutionary. Under acute threat, your amygdala takes over and drives fight or flight responses rather than deliberate reasoning. This is exactly the wrong cognitive state for clinical decision making. And chronic poor nutrition keeps your cortisol elevated baseline, so you're starting every clinical interaction already closer to that impaired state. This is why mechanisms matter more than meal prep. I'm not asking you to follow a plan. I'm asking you to understand the mechanism well enough that you would never intentionally put yourself in a cognitively impaired state before a clinical shift. Because once you truly understand the physiology, once you understand that not eating before clinical is the equivalent of asking your brain to perform complex reasoning with its executive function partially offline, the decision to prioritize fueling becomes obvious. It becomes clinical. It becomes part of how you take care of yourself the same way you take care of your patients. Practical takeaways. All right, evidence-based, not preachy. I am not telling you to meal prep 47 containers of chicken and broccoli every Sunday like some fitness influencer. I'm telling you to stop showing up to clinical on gas station coffee and a prayer. Here's what that actually looks like in practice. Before clinical, you want protein plus a complex carbohydrate plus a fat. That combination gives you amino acids for neurotransmitter production, sustained glucose for working memory, and dietary fat to slow gastric emptying further, all contributing to stable blood glucose for 3 to 4 hours. Classic example, 2 eggs, a bowl of oats, and half an avocado. No, it may not be sexy or Instagram worthy, but it does not require elaborate preparation. Takes 15 minutes. Your brain will absolutely notice the difference. Other options: Greek yogurt with berries and a handful of nuts. Whole grain toast with nut butter and an egg. The macronutrient profile matters more than the specific food. During clinical, small, frequent fuel, not a full meal. You don't have time for that, and you probably don't want one. But strategic snacking during breaks is not optional. It is cognitive maintenance. Almonds, walnuts, an apple, a string cheese, a hard-boiled egg you prepped the night before, a protein bar with a reasonable ingredient list. You are topping off the tank between big meals. You are preventing the blood sugar valleys that impair afternoon performance. Keep something in your bag. Make it accessible. Eat on your break, even a short one. Not vending machine garbage if you can avoid it, but honestly, a bag of mixed nuts from a vending machine is better than nothing. After clinical recovery nutrition, your cortisol has been elevated for hours. Your glycogen stores are depleted. Your brain is fatigued. A recovery meal should prioritize complex carbohydrates to replenish glycogen, quality protein to support neurotransmitter restoration, and anti-inflammatory foods if possible, which can include omega-3 rich sources like salmon, sardines, or walnuts. This is also the meal most nursing students skip or replace with fast food on the way home. And the physiological consequence is poor sleep quality, because recovery nutrition also impacts overnight neurological restoration and memory consolidation. What you eat after clinical affects how well your brain processes what you learned during clinical. Night shift. Timing matters enormously. Eat a substantial, balanced meal before your shift begins, not in the middle of the night when glucose tolerance is lower. During the shift, graze on protein and fat-dominant foods rather than carbohydrate-heavy snacks, which will produce more significant blood sugar variability when your insulin sensitivity is decreased. Avoid heavy carbohydrate meals in the early morning hours when you need your brain to keep functioning until handoff. And after your shift, prioritize sleep before a large meal. Your metabolic and cognitive recovery depends more on the sleep than on the post-shift eating. Exam day. This is not the day to try something new. Eat the breakfast you've practiced eating. Protein, complex carb, fat. Time your caffeine to peak about 30 to 45 minutes before you need to be sharpest. Hydrate well the day before. Arriving to an exam already behind on hydration is a setup for the 2% cognitive impairment threshold within the first hour. And eat again if the exam is long. Your brain cannot run a 4-hour exam on one meal. Here's where I want to land this. Your brain is an organ. It is the most metabolically active organ in your body per unit weight. It has no reserve tank. It cannot make do with less. And it is the singular tool that makes you a provider, not your stethoscope, not your certification, not your clinical experience in isolation. Your ability to think, to reason, to recognize, to decide, that is your instrument, and that instrument requires fuel. You would not expect your patient's heart to maintain adequate cardiac output without sufficient preload. You would not expect their kidneys to function without adequate perfusion. You would not expect any organ in the body to perform optimally without its required substrates. Yet we show up to clinical, sleep-deprived, underfed, overcaffeinated and dehydrated. And then we wonder why we can't think. It's not a knowledge gap, it's a fuel gap. Clinical reasoning isn't just about how much you know. It is about having a brain that is physically capable of reasoning at the moment it is needed. You can have all the knowledge in the world, and we spend a lot of time in this podcast making sure you do. But if your working memory is contracted because your glucose crashed, if your prefrontal cortex is offline because your cortisol has been chronically elevated, if your pattern recognition is slow because your neurons don't have the substrates they need to fire efficiently, the knowledge doesn't matter. You can't access it. I know this firsthand. This is not a wellness thing. This is a clinical competence thing. Feeding your brain is part of doing your job well. It is part of taking care of your patients, because a cognitively impaired provider is a safety risk, and you became a nurse because you care about doing this well. Small changes, massive impact. You don't need a perfect diet. You don't need to overhaul your entire lifestyle before your next clinical shift. You need to eat breakfast. You need to bring something to eat on your break. You need to drink more water than you currently are. You need to stop treating caffeine like a food group. That's it. Start there. Watch what happens to your thinking. For this week's homework, and yes, I give homework because we're here to actually change something. I want you to track your nutrition before clinical for 1 week. Not to judge it, not to create a plan, just to notice. Write down what you ate, when you ate it, and then notice how your cognitive performance felt during clinical. Notice when the valleys hit. Notice whether they correlate with when you last ate. Notice whether the days you fueled well feel different from the days you didn't. This is clinical observation applied to yourself. And once you see the pattern, you cannot unsee it. Again, if you're ready to go deeper on the neuroscience behind how you learn, how you reason, and how you can build the kind of pattern recognition that makes clinical feel less chaotic, make sure you sign up for the waitlist for Think Like a Provider Academy on School. We will have a whole community of students who are building these foundations together, because clinical competence is not built in isolation. You can find everything at Think Like a Provider. The link is in the show notes. You can't think like a provider if your brain is running on fumes. Feed it. Your patients will thank you. I'll see you next week. Make sure you're taking care of yourselves.